Hello, my name's Adela and I make minis. This month I've challenged myself to make 100 vases in 100 days. So every mini vase that I make starts with a blob of clay, and it's usually just the size of a thimble. I begin the process with the body, which is the biggest part of each vase, and I usually start with the bottom half. Because everything's so small, I tend to use tools more than I use my fingers because my fingers are pretty chunky. So here I'm using the end of a paintbrush to open up the clay to allow space for my finger to then go in and pinch the rest of the way out. And I'll do this with both the top and the bottom. Once I've got my two halves, I'll join it with a tiny little sausage of clay. This makes sure that the join is strong, because even though they're small, they've still got to be functional, and they're going to go through a lot of stress in the kiln, and I have to make sure that every single join and seam isn't going to blow open. Next up is the neck, which similarly to the body, I will join with another sausage, just to make sure. I then move on to the rim, which I like to just pinch open slowly. And then the fiddliest part of the whole process, handles. They're small, they dry out super quickly, so you always need to work a little bit faster than you have been. Generally, these tiny pieces dry out a lot faster than larger pieces. Usually if you're working on a huge piece, you can leave it, cover it up, it'll stay wet for, weeks at a time if you store it properly. These little boys, not so much. Usually by the end of the hour, they'll be hard enough to start scraping back. We call that leather hard in ceramics. And this means that if you squeeze it, it won't, instantly collapse on itself. I did add a fancy little foot on this guy, but in the end I decided he didn't need it. Sometimes simpler is better. Day 2 starts just the same as day 1. We begin with the body. A similar shape to yesterday, but it doesn't mean that it will ultimately end up looking the same. Once the two halves are joined, you've essentially sealed air into that shape, which means that you can apply a bit more pressure than usual and the shape won't collapse. I like to pat the shape down with my wooden tool and then finalise it by scraping it back with a metal rib, which gets things really nice and smooth. When I first started, a lot of my pieces were lumpy because I was too scared to press down, but these little guys are pretty tough and they can withstand quite a bit of manhandling. So once the neck is on, it's time to do the rim. Now, sometimes the rim will crack when I pinch it open, and this is mainly to do with the fact that the clay's dried out quite a bit and it's not flexible enough to open out. But the nice thing about clay is that you can always re-wet it, add some more clay, and Bob's your uncle, good as new. Now, yesterday's fancy foot didn't quite work out, so I thought I'd try again with this one. A thimble is usually a really good size for these feet. And the final and fiddliest step, as always, are the handles. I did think about adding a little face to this guy, but in the end I opted for some black slip, which I'm then going to cover with a transparent glaze later on, and it's going to come out looking a little bit like a pebble or a rock. You get some nice blacks from the slip, but then the glaze brings out some blues and some whites, and it's just milky and mottled and really, really lovely. And there he is. Day 2, another cutie. So for day 3, I decided to go for a much narrower bottom. I usually achieve this by rolling the clay whilst it's on the paintbrush, and that way you get a nice tapered edge. So once I've got the body looking exactly how I want it, I'm going to move on to the neck. And the neck is probably the simplest and most straightforward part of the whole thing. I'll roll out a little tiny slab of clay, and then I'll wet the edges, place it on the body, make sure I've got it exactly where I want it. Sometimes you need to turn it around, see it from all angles and shifty it about. But once it's there, I'll tack it down and add my sausage just to make sure that that join is good. Now sometimes when you add a sausage, because you're adding extra clay, you can make that part of the pot much chunkier than you want it. And that part is called the shoulder, where the neck and the body meet. And sometimes you need to get in there and push that clay back down and reshape it. I usually do this, again, with my trusty paintbrush, just to sort of really get in there and get a nice sharp line. This was yet another one where the rim cracked. The clay that I'm working with this week has been either way too soft or just way too hard. So it's been a little bit of a juggling act. But as always, you can just patch that right up and no one would ever know. So I'm back home and I've got a new sexy angle, and I'm hoping that this will let you see a little bit more detail. So the guy I'm making today is going to be much smaller and much squatter. So once I've joined together my body and my neck and pinched out my rim, I'm going to move on to the handles. Now, depending on the shape of your handles, you don't always have to add a sausage, but I quite like the shape that the sausage gives to the handles. It makes it look like the handles are growing out of the body rather than just stuck on. And here you can see one side I've added sausages and the other one hasn't, and there is a little bit of a difference. And that's all personal preference. I just think it looks cuter like this. So once we've got the basic shape down, it's time to think about how is this little guy going to stand up. Now sometimes you'll see me tapping down onto the table for some of these, and that's just to level out the bottom so it can stand up on its own. But sometimes I feel like it needs a little foot, and this is one of those. This time I opted for something pretty simple, just because I liked the shape that it gave you overall. But one thing I have learnt the hard way is that whether you're having a foot or not, you are going to have to make the bottom concave, because that's what's going to give it that stability. The larger the area that's on the bottom, the more likely you are to have a wobbly pot. When I first started, probably 99% of my minis were wobbly. On my larger pieces, I usually just smack the bottom with a spoon and then that gives you a nice little shape. But for these guys, I like to opt for either the back of the brush or even the top of a pencil, whatever's the best shape. Sometimes social media is a good thing, and on day 6 I saw a new ceramicist on Instagram that was working with inlay, and I was absolutely in love with this technique and I thought I need to try it. I'd never done it before, so I was excited to see whether it would work or not. So once I'd worked the body first, which today was weirdly lumpy, I haven't made a lumpy one like this in a while. So once that lumpy body was done, I then incised the pattern. I scratched the pattern in with a blunt pencil. Once I was happy with that and got all the fluffy bits out the way and cleaned it up, I then started filling those gaps with coloured slip. I went for black for this one because I'm hoping that it will pop once it's fired. And you do that maybe 1 or 2, 3 layers, just whenever you feel that that's filled in. And then the scary part, scratching away all of the layers that you've just built up so that you get a nice smooth surface, and hopefully where you've made that gap, you've now got a colour. I was a little bit scared that I might scratch too deep and then lose the pattern, but thankfully it came out looking pretty good. It was a little bit smudgy and I probably could have done a better job, but I was just too scared of going too deep, aren't we all? I'm excited to see how this one turns out once it's been through the kiln. Maybe he'll be even cuter, maybe he won't. So today I decided to play with opposites. Here I've gone for a really wide body, and I thought wide body and then a really long skinny neck. So here I'm rolling it out, joining together and then seeing how it's going to look. I think this one is a little bit too long, but we're going to join it first and see. As amazing as new shapes are, they can start to pose some problems, and mainly those problems are being able to see. This one was really hard to cut out the opening because the neck was so narrow. I had to really get in there with a torch and a needle, and I was quite scared I was going to lose that lump that I was cutting out and it was going to drop to the bottom, but thankfully I managed to fish it out. The smaller you go, the more problems happen, but I think it ended up being worth it. I did trim it down a little bit because I thought it was a bit too long, and then pinching out the rim, just a tiny one this time, and then adding the final touch, which as always are the handles. Okay, so that is week 1 done and dusted, but this is only just the beginning, because there's still 93 more minis to make. I hope you enjoyed this video, thanks for sticking to the end, and if you don't want to miss next week's, please do subscribe. See you then!